But I think maybe the more interesting debate, right, rather than doing the like sort of third drawer, James Carville thing and trying to, trying to argue about what's going to play with who, where, right, is to argue about the principle of the thing, right, like, and that's what we've gotten into it about, right, in the past, right, so because your objection to taxation, certainly to any kind of like government redistribution, isn't just that some of it's going to be put to horrifying purposes, that it's going to be used to murder people, right? Like that's, I mean, if that were the beginning and end of it, right? Like that's not exactly a small thing, right? But it's not just that, right? Like even if we had some situation that I would love, right? Where like we wound down all the foreign wars, and we weren't assassinating people with drones anymore, and we weren't doing this like super aggressive regime of police and incarceration, but we were still, we were still doing lots of redistribution at home. There were all sorts of taxpayer-funded programs to finance healthcare and education and all that other good stuff that I like, right? I think that from your perspective, you'd still have a problem with that, not necessarily because of the outcome, right, but because of the process, because you think that taxation itself is unjust.
Well, sure. I mean, look, I think of, as we discussed on my podcast, I am a libertarian. I believe taxation is theft. That being said, obviously, I would prefer if someone mugged me that they not spend the money on murdering somebody else. And if they spent the money on like grandma's hip replacement, that certainly would be preferable.
Right. The hierarchy, go back to that hierarchy.
Yes, there you go. Sure, yes. Right, so, and by the way, even just a quick aside, but even Ron Paul, the most libertarian person to ever be in Congress or run for the presidency, even he basically said, let's cut the military budget and tide over entitlement programs. Like even he was like, okay, prescriptions for grandma are a lot better than dropping bombs on human beings. So yes, I reject on moral grounds the idea of the government, of government taxation. But even aside from that, I think one of the problems that your types are going to have is that there is like I remember when I was on Jimmy Dore's show recently, and he said, libertarians basically say that the government is inherently evil, but it's just a vessel, it can be used for bad or good. And what I would say, my response to that would be like, well, technically that's true, but that's also technically true about authoritarian dictatorship. I mean, it's a vessel. It could theoretically, because like theoretically, you could say we have a dictator who's going to just dictate nothing but good things. But the problem that we would all see with that is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so if you give this state the monopoly on theft, which is how I see it, and you give them this enormous power, I think more often than not, I mean, look what happened even when this pandemic first hit. What's the first thing they do? Go bail out the banks. Oh my God, people are dying in nursing homes. We better give the bankers a couple $1 trillion. That ought to show it. And this, to me, I empathize with your humanitarian impulses. I want to help people who need to be helped. I don't believe that the state apparatus will ever achieve those goals.
Yeah. So I think that one maybe productive way to think about that is to hone in on part of what you said that I agree with, right? Which is that there's the reason that we wouldn't, trust having dictatorships that might decide to be benevolent, right? Is that power corrupts, and then I guess from my perspective, I think two things there, right? One is I would argue that other forms of power also have, corrupting effects. Go back to what you identified earlier as the case that seemed more disturbing about Louis C.K. about the that involved a workplace situation, right? And there is a reason why. Certainly, if somebody is an employee, right, you have power over them that way, right? That would be more disturbing, right? And I generally think. There's a concern that if you have forms of power that aren't necessarily organized in the state, right? That some people depend on other people for their livelihood. That's going to lead to a lot of abuses, whether of the Harvey Weinstein form or what I, from my perspective, the Jeff Bezos form, right? You start thinking about some of the work conditions at Amazon warehouses. And so to my mind, the solution, right, to power corrupting is to distribute power, not kind of however, like, let the chips fall where they may with the market and like whatever you end up with that, right? But to try to distribute power as evenly as possible, which I think you can have through a democratic state, right? Especially if we frankly, right, to get into our really deep disagreements, right, if we did something about capitalism, so political discussions weren't distorted by having part of the population that had tremendous wealth and power and hence political influence that the rest of the population doesn't, and by extending democracy to even the workplace, right? Through things like businesses being organized not as traditional businesses but as cooperatives, which I know you're not against the outcome, right? But you think that but you are very concerned about like the property rights, right, of existing owners, right? That would be your objection to
Sure.
that, right? And
Well, I mean, like
I
that's
know that's a deeper issue, right? But like
sure,
I would
sure.
I would just say, right, that like, yeah, I think power corrupts. I think that's why we need to create an economic structure where power is distributed more evenly, certainly, than it is right now.
Well, I agree. I would like to see an economic structure where power is distributed more equally. I mean, I think that that's a good goal. But look, if you talk about, objecting to the means and not the end, I mean, it's like I'm not against sex, but I'm against rape. And if they both end in the same thing, that doesn't, like, the means are pretty important when you get down to, the morality of the situation. I think that
If you're doing it
whether
the right way, the consensual version involves a lot less trauma at the end. But okay,
that
so
is
it's
that
not
is
quite the
true.
same outcome. But yeah, go
Well,
for it.
well, okay, but I mean the actual physical act. All right, this
Yes,
is
right.
going off into a place I didn't mean to take it to, but I would say that you're absolutely right that there are many forms of power that are other than state power, but we could still see a difference between voluntary interactions and forced interactions. And even if you say that you have a democratic state, okay, but that is essentially just the rule of the majority being imposed on the minority. And throughout history, I don't think that there's a ton of evidence to suggest that the majority is usually, let alone always, correct, and that they respect the rights of the minority. Pretty much anytime history goes bad, that's not what's happening. And the power dynamic for, say, someone between boss and employee is very real. But if there was a boss who wouldn't allow you to quit, now we're into the realm of slavery. And if you have a state where the minority, who didn't necessarily support the policies, and by the way democracies usually work out, even if the majority votes someone in, it doesn't really mean they support what they're doing afterward. So I understand your issue with power in general. What I don't understand is that if you have this issue with power, how you're not opposed to the state, which is a much more naked, much more dangerous version of this power. This is an institution that can rob from you. They can throw you in a cage. They can draft you to go die in one of their horrible foreign wars, or, like we said before, even worse, be on the other end of one of their wars.
Yeah.
So it's, like, that power to me seems to be a much worse, a much graver threat. And I think a lot of history backs me up on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, states can clearly do awful things, can clearly be the vehicles, for some of the greatest state atrocities we can have, no doubt whatsoever about that. I'd push back on whether that means that the better thing would be to try to just not have one. I think that obviously it's a much bigger discussion, but I think that that if we still, especially in a situation where we still had all sorts of disparities of wealth and resources and economic power, I think trying to just not have a state, I think would maybe mean that we don't have a centralized state, right? But we have, frankly, I think the Mad Max sort of objection to that, right, holds some sway to me, right, especially since presumably people have to have their security needs met in some way. And so if there isn't a state where at least those security forces, it's a very imperfect check, right, but at least there's some sort of theoretical accountability to the public in general, and not just to the particular people who are paying for them, that still seems preferable to me. But
well, I just say I understand your concerns, but I mean, like, let's take a look at the state security force that we have. I mean, currently, as we're speaking, when there's like uprising across the country against these state security forces, which are forced on people. It doesn't seem to me to be that the most vulnerable communities particularly appreciate these state security forces when they're not. They for all the militarization of our police. When there's riots and looting, they do nothing. They just stand back. When there's peaceful protests, they're throwing 90-pound girls on the floor, and they're putting their necks on this guy's neck and for 9 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, and that's just one story. I mean, there's
yeah,
a
right.
lot more out there. So it can go pretty bad that way.
It could go horrifically bad, no doubt whatsoever about that. But the question to my mind is what the route is to something better, right? And what's going to lead to something better versus what might actually make it worse, right? So I would point, for example, to the history in the, kind of the Gilded Age, right? When it was much more common to have essentially like private armies, with the Pinkertons, for evidence that oftentimes, the private version, what few checks on their behavior that you might get right now, you might not even get. Conversely, I would point to some European social democracies where cops don't even necessarily go armed, right, on routine patrols, right? Now, I'm not saying that it's always, the combinations are always going to work like that.
Sure.
There's some guarantee, right? But I think what I'm hopeful about, right, is that as part of a general process of reducing poverty and economic inequality and all of that, right? And granted, it'd be very hard in the United States because of the, because this is such a generally well-armed country, right? So you have problems with that approach here that you wouldn't in other places.
Right.
But
So
that those two could go together in a positive way. But you were saying,
hey, I kind of agree with you. I mean, look, it's a bitter pill that I've got to swallow, but it turns out that your beloved Sweden is the most free market country in the world right now. So they're the ones who have been allowed to.
You mean in terms of the coronavirus lockdowns?
Yeah. Well, I'm just making the point that it doesn't necessarily, having state interference or intervention in one area doesn't necessarily lead to more of it in another. And so I certainly get your point on that. I guess I would say that, look, inequality in itself, to just be against inequality is slightly imprecise. And there are certain forms of inequality that I'm sure that you wouldn't even object to. Like if you just started this show, congratulations, you're going to put on an amazing show and a lot more people want to watch your show than want to watch some terrible show out there. That's fine. That's like, there's not a problem with that.
I don't want to redistribute viewers from
right.
For this show to other show,
and I think we would all agree.
That's certainly right. So
there are some forms of inequality that are okay, and there's some forms that are not okay, and we would probably both agree with that. I would just say that one of to me, the major driver of inequality of the not okay variety in the United States for sure right now, and I think we both agree on this, is it's the marriage of corporations and the state, and the fact that so many of these huge players are granted legal privileges, the cartelization of the entire economy, and so many. I mean, there are listen, every one of these big banks basically just rakes in hundreds of billions in profit, and it's all off a state cartel Federal Reserve system. So I agree with you that certainly we would probably live in a better world with less of the unfair inequality that we have.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously the disagreement there is going to be what it takes for inequality to be unfair. Sure. And I'm relatively unbothered by inequality in popularity, inequality in, I don't know, whatever, like their inequality in which hockey teams, get to like drink from the Stanley Cup, at the end of the season, stuff like that. I think that when you get into inequality in resources, that's going to lead to inequality in power and political influence, and ability to control what's going on in a lot of people's lives at workplaces. I have a much bigger problem with that. Obviously, we also have, disagreements. Some of the stuff, a couple of the subjects that you just mentioned, that the coronavirus lockdown, some of the post George Floyd, unrest. Um, but but I really appreciate you coming on to just like start to hash a little bit of this out, for a much better response to some of the taxation and theft stuff that I actually gave in that debate. You can check out a article that I wrote for Jacobin on, came out on Tax Day, July 15th. Forgive the clickbaity title that friend Bhaskar put on it, but it does lay out, I think, what if I could redo that, I wish I'd said. So maybe you can come back sometime and we can talk more about this.
I'd be happy to, and I'd love to have you back on my show as well. Congrats on the new show. And can I just say, before I leave, just my condolences on Michael. That's I was just, horrified to hear that. I never met Michael, but he's kind of the reason me and you know each
Yeah.
other with those back
Yep.
and forth segments that we did. And he was a really talented guy, and just horrible that he died so young. So rest in peace, and my condolences to all you guys. And thank you so much for having me on.
I really appreciate that. Thank you, Dave.